So that Milton Berle episode that we did a few months ago was a big hit, so why not talk about another Saturday Night Live tragedy? This one's a tragedy in a different sense. This time you don't really feel bad for the host. No, you feel bad for literally everybody else, even the audience. My friends, welcome to that terrible time when Steven Seagal was the guest host of Saturday Night Live.
Does that bother you?
This episode has gone down in infamy as one of the worst episodes of any television show ever. And I always had a little bit of skepticism to that. I thought, really? An episode of Saturday Night Live could be that bad? After I did some research, I realized, yeah, it probably is pretty bad, but I don't think I'm gonna go out of my way to see it. But then the Milton Berle episode was a big hit, with tons of people demanding I talk about the Steven Seagal one next. And sure enough, it became the Masters of Fate pick for this month, so now I've got no choice. I visited my parents one weekend and my dad, against his better judgment, sat down to watch this thing with me and man were they right! This was a hot mess. Actually no, hot mess would imply that there's something going on. Something interesting or exciting. This is just a bunch of cold, moldy fish. It's surstrumming.
What the hell is this?
But what exactly happened and how did the episode end up this bad? Well, I'm gonna explain it all for you right now. As per usual, Saturday Night Live was looking for a new guest host for this week, and they came across Steven Seagal. He agreed to take part, and right there, everything became terrible. From the minute he started working with the writers, Steven Seagal was impossible to work with. Firstly, he came up with terrible ideas for sketches. Last time I mentioned how all of Milton Berle's ideas were outdated, but at the end of the day, they were still comedy. At one point in time, you could consider those relevant. Steven Seagal's ideas, on the other hand, were anything but. One of his sketch ideas was about a therapist who sees a woman that had just been raped, then tries to squeeze a bunch of money out of her, and then rape her himself.
I beg your pardon, Doctor.
Seagal's reasoning for this was, this is how therapists are. All they do is try to take your money. Okay. Through some miracle, they were able to come up with enough sketches for this show to pad out the hour-long runtime. Few, if any, of Seagal's ideas were used. But partially because of this difficult writing process, and the fact that they just didn't have a lot of ideas anyways, nobody was all that happy with the sketches that they came up with, especially not Steven Seagal. He was miserable during rehearsals, and because of that, he brought everybody else down with him. The man just didn't seem to know how to have fun. All of his lines were monotone, he had a really bored or angry looking face the entire time, and the worst part, he didn't have a sense of humor when it came to himself. One of the most accepted jokes on Saturday Night Live is when the guest host takes a little bit of time to poke fun at themselves in their career. Seagal wanted the opposite. He wanted this episode of Saturday Night Live to be all about how Steven Seagal is one of the most amazing people to ever live. For instance, in the Hans and Franz skit that opened this episode up, the plan was originally going to be about comparing Arnold Schwarzenegger to Steven Seagal. Hans and Franz would berate Seagal, telling him that Schwarzenegger was far stronger than he was and could easily beat him in a fight. Seagal would do his lines flatly and angrily. Dana Carvey had to pull Seagal aside and ask him what the problem was.
Quote, I just wish Arnold was here so I could kick his f***ing ass.
So they had to rewrite the sketch to remove any trace of humor, and just talked nicely about Steven Seagal, and he boringly and flatly put Hans and Franz in their place.
Who taught you that stuff? But it's kind of silly, you know what I'm saying?
That was one of the two ways that the sketches featuring Seagal would go. What was the other part? Well, if you can't do anything negative or even neutral about the host, then your best bet is to make jokes about what they do best. And for Seagal, that would be hand-to-hand combat, which means that all of the jokes would be about him doing some sort of violent act, punching people, attacking a conference room, throwing people out of windows, that sort of stuff. And while it's funny the first time, it is not funny the 40th. There's a sketch where he plays a disgraced cop and he just beats people up all the time. And then there's this overly long sketch at the end where they're parodying an action movie, which on paper makes sense. Seagal's claim to fame was being in action movies, so trying to poke fun at that would be a great fit, but again, you can't make fun of Steven Seagal. So instead, they just played it straight with a slightly quirky premise. The sketch would have been bad enough, but it just drags and drags. As far as I can tell, this is one of the only 2 Seagal ideas that made it into the episode, the other being the Andrew Dice Clay bit, which, yeah, painful, but not nearly as painful as this. Trust me, I could go on and on about how that segment's one of the worst things I've ever seen, but I don't have to. Bob Odenkirk did it for me.
He wrote a scene, and it's the last scene in the show, and it's like one of his movies, but they tried to do it live. They got some stuntmen to come in. It's insane. There's like this board of directors. There's a bunch of stuntmen in suits. As a viewer, you're like, who are these actors? They're not in the cast. There's like some speech, and then he enters the banquet room and starts beating them up, and it goes on for like 8 minutes. It's the longest scene you've ever seen. And then at the very end, he turns to camera and says,
This is what happens when you pollute the planet.
and the audience is mystified.
Yes, his ideas were bad. Yes, he was inflexible. Yes, he even refused to read cue cards or look at his script. But surely, when it's just him on stage, and when he's fully in control of what's going on, surely he'll let loose a little, right? Of course, I'm talking about the opening monologue. But no, that didn't happen either. The original plan was for him to sing Kung Fu Fighting while beating people up, of course, but instead, Seagal decided to play it completely straight. Once again, establishing the no fun allowed rule while he was on set, and it got so bad that the crew were asking Lorne Michaels if it was too late to get a new host. They all knew that this episode was gonna be awful. Lorne Michaels did as well, but by then, it was too late. Word had gotten around that Seagal was gonna be on the show, and they'd already put too much work into this episode, so they couldn't just fire Seagal, get a new person, write some new sketches, and go from there. They just had to let it go. And boy, did it. Seagal's mood did not change whatsoever when he was on the live stage. And in fact, his delivery and expressions were so bored and flat that he brought the other cast members down with him. If you watch some of the sketches where Seagal's not in them, the cast is up to their usual energy levels, even if the sketches aren't normally as good as they would be. But then when their special guest star comes on stage, everyone's energy levels get cut in half. There was also very few instances of audience laughter, especially in that final segment. People were just confused for the most part. Why was the guest star not putting any effort? Where were all the jokes? Why are these sketches so weird? As soon as the episode was over, Seagal was banned from SNL, never to return, though he would be mocked from time to time going forward. Many cast members, especially the ones that had to share a scene with him, considered Seagal the worst guest star that has ever been on Saturday Night Live. The only person that's had a somewhat more pleasant view of Seagal's time on the show as time went on was Lorne Michaels. Oh sure, there's that famous story where Nick Cage called Lorne Michaels up after flubbing his monologue, declaring himself the worst guest host ever, and then Michaels saying,
No, that would be Steven Seagal.
But later, Lorne Michaels would admit that it was an off day for everybody. The sketches they were coming up with weren't working, they were having a hard time coming up with snappy dialogue, so really, this was the perfect show for Seagal to be on. One that, admittedly, wasn't their best, and couldn't really be saved all that much. Now, I'll bet you're wondering, if Seagal was this unflexible, and he was this miserable while performing, why did he agree to go on SNL in the first place? Well, I can credit my dad for figuring this out. When I was watching it with him, he took particular interest in this part of Seagal's monologue. Take a listen.
Most of you probably know me from my action-adventure films, Above the Law, Hard to Kill, Marked for Death, stuff like that. My newest film, Out for Justice, which is #1 in the nation right now.
So, here's the way we see it. Seagal's star was burning really bright, and he wanted to get his name out there just a little bit more and help excite people to go see his new movie, Out for Justice. So, an appearance on Saturday Night Live would be the best way to do it. The show was really popular, it had consistently strong ratings, and it's just comedy. How hard could it be? Heck, you don't even really have to try. As long as you show up, You get paid in money and exposure. None of this is confirmed, of course. This is just a theory we've come up with, and admittedly, knowing some of Steven Seagal's mindsets and the way he views things, I wouldn't really be all that surprised. After seeing the episode for myself, yes, I can confirm that Steven Seagal is indeed the worst host in all of Saturday Night Live. Going back to Milton Berle, yes, some of his stuff was dated, and yes, he was difficult to work with, but as the cast themselves would say in later years, the whole experience was just sad. Berle wanted to feel like he belonged, and to be reminded that people still cared about him at the end of the day. But no matter what he tried, he couldn't succeed. This ended up proving that his time had passed. And while he would get some jobs later on, they would be nothing compared to what he used to get, and frankly, were not the way that he was hoping to spend his later years.
Up, down. Remember when those words had a whole different meaning?
As I said in the last video, his story is a tragedy. You feel bad for him despite what he went through and what he caused, but Steven Seagal? I have no sympathy for him whatsoever. The best thing you can say about him is, at least he didn't assault somebody like Chevy Chase. One of the basic things that a host could be asked for when appearing on Saturday Night Live is to at least try. If the sketches stink, if you don't like the co-stars, fine, but at least put in an effort for the audience's sake, but Seagal wouldn't do it. There may have been some pretty bad hosts that came after his time, but no matter what, Seagal will always hold the place of #1 biggest SNL loser. Well folks, thanks for watching the video. What'd you guys think? Have you seen the Steven Seagal episode? If so, what are your thoughts and how are you still alive? Also, if Steven Seagal's not the worst host, who do you think is? I really want to know. Comment below and let me know because I'm always excited to hear what you guys have to say. And now it's time to thank our wonderful Patreon people, starting with our Masters of Fate. Chan 11, Drew the Stew, Kev Messick, Manny Paredes, MD the Dude, Platinum Bass, Quiet Chap, Ryan Williams, Timey, and Woody Woo. And now our executive producers, Aaron Vasquez, Albert Robinson, Blackjack, HR Huffman, Indiscreet One, Orsinus, Ravioli Supremo, Unkale, and who else but Zane. If you too would like your name read at the end of every Media Mementos video, then why not consider donating to the Patreon? There's a fancy little link in the description below for you to check out. And if you want to get more involved in the Media Mementos fan community, down there we've also got a link to the Media Mementos Discord server, so stop on by and say hello. Alright folks, thanks for watching the video and I'll see you guys next time.
This is what happens when you pollute the planet.
Shut up!
Don't you understand that there are people out there who love the planet?